Does Britain still have free speech?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I'd have to be difficult there and say, in fact, we've never had unfettered free speech in Britain. I mean, in the centuries gone past, it was kings, queens, bishops and lords who controlled the speech of plebs like you and I. There was a conservative bent to censorship. The idea of an individual not being able to say that was in line with things like heresy, things like treason. So, for a very long time, speech hasn't been completely free. But moving closer up to our current moment in the political movements for suffrage, for political change, for democracy in the 20th and coming up now to the 21st century, there has been great expansion of our belief in freedom of speech and our understanding that it's important. The depressing thing that I think, as you pointed out, in the last 20 and 30 years, there's been a reversal of that move towards the understanding of why free speech is at the heart of any democracy. There's been a kind of growing mistrust of what publics will do with free speech. So either if you allow young people to say what they like, they'll probably be racist. If you allow viewers to watch what they like on telly, they'll probably buy propaganda. And if you allow papers to publish what they like, then probably everyone will get misinformed and we'll all live in a hellhole. And I think that kind of mistrust of the intelligence and the nous of the public has come back to is a kind of a repeating of an old elitist view of who can handle free speech, who can handle access to information, that's been sort of reheated and rehashed for the 21st century.
Edwina Currie, there seems to be an emerging theme that if there is a broadcaster we don't like, a comedian we don't like, a television network we don't like, we get rid of it, we cancel it.
Well, may I say that we've been exercising free speech on this channel all evening, and I'm here, for example, to say that I think Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty are wonderful men. I thought all your panel before us were talking complete rubbish, and that we are very lucky indeed to have had Sage, and I, for one, on GB News, want to say thank you to them for all their help and advice and guidance and all the many thousands of lives that I believe that they have saved. Right, now what was your question?
Well, of course, you've demonstrated free speech, and I guess that's what GB News is all about, Edwina, and I acknowledge what you've had to say. I think actually the majority of the public have been and are supportive of the measures that we've seen in the course of the pandemic. So once again, Edwina, you are the woman of the people. But do you not think, for example, shutting down RT from the UK is a rather ham-fisted way of dealing with the Russia situation?
Well, they've been shut out of airways in this country and many other countries, not because of what they're saying and doing, but because of part of sanctions. This is the West's way of bringing pressure to bear on Putin and the Russian government, who are currently the aggressors in a neighbouring country, and a very bloody aggression it is indeed. And if they carry on like that, and they are allowed to get away with it, then other countries closer to home will be next. And that's one of the reasons why a large range of sanctions, including stopping banks, getting them out of the SWIFT system so they can't be banking, and looking at ways of reducing our dependence, both short-term and long-term, on Russian oil and gas. That's why these actions are being taken, and they will be taken over coming months. And I suspect they're going to be in place for some time. It's not to do with trying to stop RT saying what they want or broadcasting what they want, and they have other ways of doing it. Their views are all over Twitter, for example. But I think in this country we should be aware that what they have been peddling recently has been a very Russian view of things, and it's a wrong one. It's the one that Putin is peddling to his own people. It's the one that he is, with some increasing signs of desperation, peddling to the world. And what the rest of us want is for him to stop bombing Ukraine, get out of Ukraine, get back to his own country, and let Ukraine be the free country that it wants to be.
Mike Parry, you've devoted your life and career to Fleet Street. You are the self-appointed seeker of truth and justice. You've obviously
yes, indeed.
You've profited from and relied on free speech in this country. Have we still got it?
We've still got it, but you've got it now with caution. Free speech is now with caution. Sometimes, just following on from what Edwina has just said, sometimes free speech can be too free if it becomes propaganda. And the only place in the world where free speech turns into propaganda is, believe it or not, in the free world, because you're entitled to, or you're enabled to express any form of opinion you want, and that opinion is listened to by millions of people. In dictatorial societies, you don't have free speech, therefore there is not an opinion to which other people can fall into. Take, for instance, the fact that Putin now, about, I would say, on day one of this horrendous situation we've got now, I put out a tweet in which I said, I can't believe that it's beyond the wit of intelligence services and the US and the West to take out Vladimir Putin. Because if you take him out, that means problem's over. And you wouldn't believe the response I got. I was called a murderer. You're a murderer. You're inciting murder. Funnily enough, over the last couple of days, every newspaper I've read said the solution to this is to take out Putin. So what I'm saying is you can have an original idea and you can float that idea, but in this modern age of social media, it only takes 1% of people to have a distorted view of what you've said for your free speech initiative to become nasty and awful and terrible, which of course it wasn't. It was practical and logical that if you got rid of Vladimir Putin, the whole problem would be over. But that is the problem with social media. People don't understand that on social media, it's about 99% of the damage on social media is caused by 1% of people who just regularly go over and over and over on what you've said and try to make it look as though you're the aggressor, you're the perpetrator, when in fact, and again, as Edwina's just said, actually you're mostly talking common sense. But common sense seems to have gone out the window in the modern day and age because common sense to most people is dictatorial, and it's not.
Yeah, Peter, let me come to you. Great to have you back on the programme. Peter Edwards, former editor of Labour List. We've seen many high-profile examples of an assault on free speech, haven't we? We've seen the comedian Roy Chubby Brown having his show at the Sheffield City Halls cancelled. We've seen attempts to end the career of Jimmy Carr for an admittedly disgusting joke, but a joke it was, and that's his job. One of the musicians in Mumford & Sons was essentially cancelled, hounded out of his job for saying on Twitter that he'd read a book about Antifa, which he thought was interesting. And, of course, most recently, Professor Kathleen Stock, OBE, a British philosopher and writer, hounded out of her job at Brighton University, Sussex University, for saying that there are two biological sexes. It doesn't sound like free speech to me.
Well, I think it's nonsense to say that free speech has been curtailed because of the pandemic. To take one example of Kathleen Stock, the academic, as long as academics are expressing lawful views, they should of whether we disagree or not. And to talk about RT, formerly Russia Today, the reason for taking because of the pandemic is because of the evil acts of Vladimir Putin killing innocent families and children in Ukraine. We've got to be very clear what the reasons is for. Finally, in terms of the pandemic, we've had a vigorous debate over where Boris Johnson broke rules. We've had, at times, furious debate over COVID restrictions. And you've launched a TV channel. To me, it's absurd to say free speech is being curtailed.
What about the campaigns to actually have GBNews defunded?
Well, GBNews is funded by the private sector, so I mean that seems a moot point, really. Businessmen and women can invest in what they want, whether that's for a profit motive or an ideological motive. But GBNews, like every TV channel, comes under the orbit of broadcasting regulation. I also think there's a bit of a danger in perpetuating a myth that we don't have free speech. The very existence of this discussion and this disagreement shows we're having free speech.
Edwina Curry, if I could come back to you. Very interesting, the point Peter Edwards made about the pandemic. I'll give you an example of what I consider to be big tech censorship. The European Medicines Agency held a press conference in which they advised against multiple regular boosting, for example, every 4 or 6 months, because they said that this might not be great for the immune system, the European Medicines Agency. That video, that press conference, was censored by Twitter and flagged up as misleading content.
Well, because it sounds wrong. I'm a former health minister with a scientific background, albeit a long time ago, and it certainly sounds wrong to be suggesting that we should have multiple vaccinations over and over and over again if it can be avoided. Your natural immune system is always
But Edwina, this is the European Medicines Agency. That's the equivalent of the MHRA in this country. We can hardly accuse them of being anti-vaxxers, but they were censored by Twitter.
Let me just introduce you, if I may, Mark, to a new idea. Just because an organisation has the word European before it doesn't mean that they're all geniuses.
That's true.
Right? And there was a great deal of argument and debate during the pandemic about how to handle it. You know, at the beginning of a pandemic, the beginning of something quite extraordinary, there are no experts, and all views really carry much the same weight. After a while, as you acquire some experience and the data becomes available, then some views are shown to be simply wrong or less adequate. And after a while, you get to the point where other things are happening as well that nobody's really thought about. I mean, I don't think anybody really realized how big an effect it was all going to have on cancer patients and on other people waiting, for example, or how big an effect it would have on education. Nobody expected it was going to last so long. It's 2 years since we really came to the recognition that something horrible was happening with this pandemic. So I think we should be just that little bit more forgiving. As for the examples that you mentioned earlier, like Professor Kathleen Stock, I think the condemnation should be for those who won't allow any views that they regard as completely wrong. I think we should always engage with other views. We should always look at where those people are coming from, and we should always endeavour, as far as possible, if we can, to convince them. And if we can't convince them, at least our argument is being listened to by other people. So they're wrong to hound a professor out of her job. I don't think it's done her views any harm at all. She's now got a much bigger audience than she had down in the wilds of Sussex. But we should endeavour, as far as possible, to enable free speech and to enable all views to be heard and to be scrutinised and to be debated. What we're doing tonight is very, very important.
Ella Whelan, let's come back to this idea that cancel culture is a myth and that it's being dreamt up perhaps by the right on any political argument. What's your view about that? The cancel culture deniers.
Oh, my goodness. Now, that's getting complicated.
So, Edwina, I'll come back to you, Edwina. Let me just go to Ella first, if you don't mind.
As much as I'm enjoying this debate, I think we're in danger of blowing too much smoke up our backsides to suggest that this GB News discussion and our ability to have it proves that free speech is alive and well. I mean, try having a discussion about gender and biology on university campuses. Try having a discussion critical of white privilege in classrooms. Try having a discussion about vaccine mandates on Twitter. I mean, it's quite clear that there are numerous examples of ways in which speech is being curtailed. I'm also, it kind of makes me wearisome, the superficiality of the understanding of what's going on in relation to free speech. We have a government that most people spend, and I agree with them, a lot of their time slagging off, talking out about how useless Boris Johnson is, and yet have no space to criticise the fact that in relation to the online harms bill, in relation to the police court crime and sentencing bill, there are laws currently coming up on the statute books, or laws that have already been passed, that criminalise freedom to protest, as we've mentioned many times on this show, that clamp down on what people can discuss online. And as we know that Twitter and Facebook is becoming the especially after the pandemic, is becoming the new public square. So there is a real problem. In relation to Kathleen Stock, it was less the kind of nutty students who were sticking up stickers and flyers, of which I did many, many times when I was at Sussex University, and, you know, probably engaged in flyering campaigns that were worse and more facile than what was going on in relation to Kathleen Stock. The problem wasn't the students. The problem was that the university administration was unable to back their own sense of academic freedom, their own belief in academic freedom, and left that academic out in the cold. A similar thing has happened at Essex University. A similar thing has happened at Cardiff recently. So the problem with free speech is not just a number of kind of eccentrics or extremists calling for cancel culture online, or as Mike Parry suggested, 1% of Twitter. The problem is far more fundamental in terms of the laws that are passed in the country, the way in which our institutions work, and the inability for people at top level with high power, either political or institutional, to defend the idea of free speech as a principle. So I'm too tired to roll my eyes at the fact that when people suggest that this is just a myth or isn't a problem, just because you're talking about it on GB News is to be commended. But go out in the world and look at where this is happening, and you can understand that actually it's a real problem.
Peter Edwards and also Mike and Edwina, concluding thoughts, if you can, briefly. The clock's against us. Peter Edwards, let's go back to that idea that attacks on freedom of speech have been overstated. What about the university professors who said in a recent survey that they keep their views about Brexit to themselves for fear of condemnation, being ostracised, or even losing their job? What about the top medics and scientists who were afraid to speak out against COVID measures?
Well, Mark, I didn't hear all your question, but both university academics have got to speak out, and they've got to be supported by vice-chancellors of their employers to speak out. Brexit is being discussed in every street corner to quite a wearisome degree over the last 6 years. There is a free debate on that. I think universities have got to stand up, and clearly there's a wide debate on Brexit, but academics have to be allowed to state their mind, and they have to be allowed to give students views that students don't want to hear. Free speech is important, but I also think we've got a free press and a free broadcasting network as well. OK, fair enough, Peter. How about Mike Parry? Final thoughts, Mike? I wish we had longer, but what's your overview, having discussed this?
My final thoughts are that free speech is under threat in this country. And I tell you why. We have a silent majority in this country because Boris Johnson was never predicted to get an 80-seat majority in the last general election, because when people were asked in the street who you're going to vote for, a lot of them didn't reveal who they were going to vote for. Free speech is under attack from the left. And if you're a leftist, you admire free speech, providing the people who have the freedom to speak are speaking the thoughts that you think. But if you're on the right in this country, you have to be a little bit more guarded, and you have to perhaps hide your feelings and only reveal them inside a ballot box. The hidden majority are the biggest speakers of freedom in this country, but not necessarily in public.
And that's why he is a broadcasting and Fleet Street legend. Look, we'll get back to this. Only a couple of seconds to go, but it is the natural order of the universe for Edwina Currie to have the last word.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. Look, the online harms bill, which is going through, which Emma referred to, is a balancing act. Until very recently, there were no controls over what was going out on social media. And that's why we were getting children being pushed into anorexia and into self-harm and into suicide. The great tragedies have resulted, and we get child grooming. We get a whole host of genuinely criminal activities and horrifying things. If they were happening to our children, we would want to see some kind of controls. And that requires legislation. We are a free country, and governments can't just do it off the top of their hats. They have to get legislation through Parliament, and that's going through now.